It's a Wednesday evening and you're standing in a gear store, circling the jackets again. Your hand's on a waterproof shell with taped seams and a zipper that costs more than you planned. It breathes. It packs down. The tag says it'll handle the mountain. And the man behind the counter sounds like he knows. You've already got the pack, the layers, the GPS beacon, the emergency blanket, the water filter, the satellite communicator you've never once had to use. 12 pounds before food, but you feel covered. You feel like you've handled the variables. Now, the mountain men who worked the Rockies in the 1820s and 30s went out for months, sometimes half a year. In country, that'd make what you're walking into look like a park. Everything rode on one horse, and most of that horse went to traps and pelts, what they kept for staying alive, fit in a few pounds. And a good number of them came home come spring. So here's the question worth asking. How much of what's in that cart is keeping you alive, and how much is just keeping you comfortable with the idea that you don't need to know anything? My name's Cole Hartwell. I grew up in Hawkins Fork, a timber town in northwest Montana, and I've worked this country better than 50 years, 19 of them alone, in winter. The man who finished my education was a Métis trapper named Pete Dumont, who could keep himself alive a week on a knife, a blanket, and a calm head. Pete told me plain, the knowledge in your head weighs nothing, and it never breaks. He was right, and there were 3 things every mountain man swore he could never live without. 3 things that came back home with him, every spring. That's what I'm about to show you. 3 things. The knife, fire, and the rifle. I say fire specifically as flint and steel, and I'll tell you why that distinction matters in a minute. I'll give you the reason behind each one too, because a rule you don't understand is a rule you'll break the moment pressure comes up. Here's what made these 3 the ones you couldn't do without, when near everything else could be cut. The fur trade in the 1820s forced a man to keep his load lean. Every pound he packed was a pound that couldn't be traps or pelts on a horse that had its limits, and men who went out heavy paid for it in ways that mattered. What got cut was what could be done without. What stayed was what you genuinely couldn't. It works like this. The knife is what turns the country around you into something you can use. Fire answers the thing that kills a man fastest out here, which is exposure, and the rifle carries a man from surviving a night to surviving a whole season. Pull any one of those out, and the other 2 only carry you so far. I want to be plain about something before we get into each one. The old way was harder and colder, and you didn't get to do it in synthetic layers. But the logic behind these 3 choices still holds. When the mountains force the question of what you truly can't survive without, these 3 are still the answer. And each one is a skill, the tool's only as good as the knowledge behind it. A knife doesn't save you if you don't know how to use it. Flint and steel's no good to a man who's never practiced the motion till his hands know it in the dark. And a rifle's worthless without marksmanship. Out there, every shot was a thing you had to account for. The old hands didn't just carry these things, they'd mastered them, till the tools worked without thinking. That's the difference between owning a tool and having the tool be a part of you. The knife I want you to picture isn't a combat blade with a sawback spine and a tactical sheath. It's a working knife, plain carbon steel, simple wooden handle, riveted tang. The kind J. Russell and Company of Greenfield, Massachusetts, made by the thousands for the Western trade, the kind sold under the name Green River. And the phrase, done up to Green River, entered frontier talk as a way of saying a job was finished clean, because this blade sat at the center of most of the work that got done out there. It wasn't cheap by the wages of the time, but it wasn't precious either. A man carried it, used it, sharpened it, and used it some more, and he trusted it 9 or 10 winters the same way he trusted the 2 hands he was born with. Now here's why. Think about what a day in the field actually asked of a man. You've taken an animal, maybe a beaver, maybe a deer. To turn that animal into something useful, You've got to skin it without cutting the hide, flesh it clean, and section the meat for drying. That's not work you do with a rock. The Green River blade was made for exactly this. Long, sweeping cuts that saved the pelt without nicking it. Fine control around the thin places where the hide goes delicate. The pelt was the whole point of being out there for a trapper. It was his income, his reason for the season. A knife that tore it was the same as a bad day at the trading post. Then you've got meat to deal with. Slicing it thin for jerky or working it into pemmican, that dense preserved food that kept men going when the hunting went dry, took a knife, not a rock, not a sharpened stick. A knife. That's what turns a carcass into calories you can carry, and calories you can carry are what keep a man upright across a hard winter. That's all before camp. In camp, the knife stayed busy from first light to last. It carved tent pegs and shaped stakes, trimmed rawhide into lashing, mended moccasins, and set right the saddle gear. When a trapper built or checked a deadfall, the knife cut the willow stakes, shaped the trigger notch, and freed a set tangled in root and mud overnight. The knife was what turned everything just sitting there, the forest, and the riverbank, and the carcass, into something a man could actually use. The old hands understood a thing we rarely talk about today. The rifle can take a game animal, but only the knife can dress it. A man with a rifle and no knife has taken game he can't even use. It runs one direction. The rifle needs the knife after the shot, but the knife doesn't need the rifle to earn its keep. That's why, if you had to rank them, the knife comes first. Not because it's the exciting one, but because everything else leans on it being there. And there's the close-range question worth knowing. Not because it came up every day, but because it came up. The knife was a man's last resort at close quarters, not his first weapon. The rifle held that job, but in a desperate clinch against man or animal at arm's length, the belt knife was the only thing left. Stories of mountain men going knife to paw with a grisly turn-up in the old accounts, and how many are exactly true is hard to say. What's plain is the logic of it. A man in bear country with no cutting tool had fewer answers than a man with one. The knife didn't promise you anything in that moment. It changed the odds. Over time, the knife became more than a tool. Museum pieces from this era show you what a blade looks like after 9 or 10 hard winters. Worn handle, resharpened edge, steel that got cared for because not caring for it wasn't an option. Mountain men understood that. Some of them would backtrack days into bad country sooner than go without one. And while that makes a good story, the logic behind it is sound. Weeks in the backcountry with no cutting tool made every other problem harder. My grandfather Amos called it carrying short and carrying sure. 3 things on the belt that never failed beat 30 things in a box that might. One more thing about Green River steel and knives like it. Carbon steel rusts, it dulls with hard use, and it chips if you abuse it. Trappers carried a whetstone or a file and sharpened in camp as a matter of discipline. The same way a careful man cleans his rifle at day's end. A dull knife isn't the same tool going slower. It's a different tool. It takes more force, which means less control. And in wet weather skinning, more force and less control means cuts to the hand, torn pelts, and slow work when you're already running against the dark. The edge on the knife was a mirror of the man. Keep it keen, and it kept you. And I mean this plain. A sharp knife is safer than a dull one. That sounds backwards, till you've tried to force a dull blade through wet hide and felt it skip. A sharp edge does what you mean it to do. A man with a knife can make almost everything else. A man without one can make almost nothing. That's not a sentiment. That's everything I just told you, said in one sentence. The knife builds the camp, but it won't keep a man alive in that camp once the sun goes down. That's where the next one comes in. The thing that runs through every death I've talked about out here, every close call, every story that ends bad, is exposure. Not cold in the abstract. Exposure. The condition where a wet man in a wind has lost hold of his own body heat and the clock's running against him. Without fire, the math is brutal. A man soaked through at dusk, wind moving, loses heat faster than his body can make it. In good conditions, he's got hours. In bad ones, less than that. The old hands understood this with the quiet certainty of men who'd watched it happen to good people. The ability to start a fire at will, in any weather, on any kind of wood, was the line between a hard night and a last one. The tool they used for fire is worth being specific about. And stay with me here, because I know it sounds like it ought to run the other way. Matches are single use. A box of 100 matches is 100 chances to start a fire. And then you've got nothing. In long cold and wet, they go damp in the pack and fail. In rough handling, they break. When they're gone, they're gone. Lighters fail in the cold. Butane stops turning to vapor once the temperature drops hard enough. And a Rocky Mountain January drops hard enough most mornings. The lighter sits in your pocket and it just won't catch. And even if the cold doesn't stop it, a lighter runs dry, and it runs dry right when you've leaned on it most, which is exactly when you need it not to fail. The Flint and steel kit has none of those troubles. Nothing in it to freeze, nothing to run dry. No day it expires. A piece of high-carbon steel, a shard of flint or chert, and char cloth. That's scorched linen, charred part way so its fibers catch a spark and hold an ember. That's the whole of it. It can sit in a coat pocket for years and still work. A man wiped the steel on his breeches and struck it again. That was the repair. The char cloth is worth understanding on its own. Regular tinder, dry grass or shredded bark is unreliable in damp weather. Char cloth catches a spark every time. Because it's been worked, the charring lowers the point where it'll light. And here's what made the whole thing hold up out on the frontier. You could make char cloth yourself, in the field. Any piece of linen or cotton, charred slow in a tin with little vent holes till it goes black without burning clean through. The one thing the kit uses up, you can make more of. That's no accident. That's why this old way lasted as long as it did. The technique took practice. You'd hold the flint close over the char cloth so the sparks off the steel landed right on the fibers. Once a spark caught, you nursed that ember gentle and moved it to a bundle of dry, stringy tinder, then blew it up into flame. This wasn't a thing you did for the first time in a storm. The old hands trained their hands to it the same way they trained every other skill that kept them alive, through repetition, till the motion was automatic and the result came every time. A man who owned a flint and steel but had never practiced with it was no better off than a man with no kit at all. Long before the settlers brought the tinderbox, the native peoples across this continent had already mastered fire by friction. The bow drill, the hand drill, a hardwood spindle worked against a softwood board till the heat made a coal. Early colonial men wrote it down in detail, watching fire come up out of what looked like nothing. The flint and steel the mountain men carried ran on the same idea. Make heat, catch an ember, grow it into flame. Different materials, same knowledge. The tinderbox was just the store-bought version of a thing people had understood for a very long time. What fire gave a man at the end of a hard, wet day is hard to put a size to. It dried his clothes, and that's a survival matter, not a comfort one. Wet wool or buckskin against a cold body pulls the heat out of you all night long. It made water safe to drink, which the old hands knew mattered, even without a word for what was in an untreated stream. It cooked his meat, which counts for both feeding a man and not sickening him. It held back the dark, which is a matter of nerve, and also a matter of what's circling out past the light. And it told searchers where he was, if it came to that. There's more to fire than lighting one, though. The old hands knew where to build it. Under a natural windbreak, clear of overhead branches and roots, down in a hollow that held the heat instead of letting it bleed off into the open. They kept their tinder dry ahead of time. Because the moment you need fire is hardly ever the moment you've got to go hunting dry material. They worked the fire through the night, banking the coals to hold heat without burning all the fuel. The fire was a daily discipline. The flint and steel was the engine that made that discipline run. Whatever the weather, whatever the season, the knife builds the camp. Fire keeps a man alive in it, but staying alive tonight is only half the trouble. A man can go a fair while without eating, longer than most folks believe, but he can't do it forever. And with no way to take game, the country starves you slow. Before the third one, I'll say this once and let it lie. Everything I've put on this channel over the years, the fires, the knives, the food, the cold, I've gathered it all in one place. It's a book on my website. I won't bring it up again in this video. If you want it, it's there. If you don't, no matter. Now, the third one. The knife and fire let a man survive a night. The rifle let him survive a season. That's the whole of the difference. And it's worth sitting with. A man with a knife and fire can get through a cold, hard night in rough country and come out the other side alive. But getting through the winter, September to April, in a place where the nearest supply was hundreds of miles off and the next rendezvous wasn't till summer, that took a way to feed himself week after week. And that meant a rifle. The Hawken rifle, built by Jacob and Samuel Hawken out of St. Louis, became the tool of choice for the Rocky Mountain trade. It wasn't a Kentucky long rifle. Those were the eastern guns the first trappers carried west, and they came up short out here. The Kentucky long rifle ran a caliber around .40 to .45, fine for deer and smaller game in eastern woods. In the Rockies, the game was a different animal. Bison, elk, grizzly bear. The Hawken ran .50 to .55 caliber. Sometimes higher, heavier, yes, 10 to 12 pounds, with a barrel 30 to 36 inches long. But the weight was the whole point. A man who needed to drop an elk at 100 yards in cold air with one shot couldn't afford a gun built for a different country. The rifle did two jobs, and you can't pull them apart clean. The first was food. Trapping was a seasonal thing. Beaver came prime in winter, which pushed the hard trapping into the coldest, wettest months, and a trapline never promised you calories. Game could be gone for days or weeks. A man who could only trap was running his body on whatever the traps brought in. On some stretches, that was nothing. The rifle was the food a man could go and get, the thing he could take out and use when he chose to, instead of sitting and waiting on it. Mountain men built up their marksmanship as a survival skill. An accurate shot at range wasn't showing off. Black powder and lead ball were heavy, resupplied just once a year at the summer rendezvous. And every round had to count. A man who shot careless was a man who ran short of lead before the winter was done. The second job was defense. Grizzly bears weren't some dramatic backdrop in the 1820s Rockies. They were a real, daily hazard, in numbers that bear no resemblance to what's left now. The story of Hugh Glass, mauled by a grizzly and left for dead without his weapons in 1823, became a legend among the mountain men themselves, not because the encounter was exotic, but because losing your rifle in bear country was a thing everybody understood to be near a death sentence. A man without a rifle had no answer at range. He might not fight a bear in any given week, but the chance of it was always there. And the man who'd already thought it through and had the means to deal with it was a different man from the one who hadn't. The human threat was part of the country too. Mountain men moved through contested ground, and the rifle was the warning at a distance that a knife could never be. Now here's what ties all three together. Because these tools didn't work each off on its own, the flintlock rifle needed care that only fire could give it. A gun soaked in a river crossing, wet powder, a damp flint. None of that worked again till it was dried out. Fire dried the powder horn, warmed the flint, and put the rifle back in business after a bad crossing. That's part of why fire comes second in the order, not third. A man who could make fire could dry his rifle. A man who couldn't make fire had a wet gun and a cold camp and mighty few options left. The knife worked up what the rifle took. Pull it out, and a dead elk stays a dead elk. No blade to skin it and turn it into food you can pack. Pull the rifle, and the knife and fire get you through hard nights, but not through a hungry winter. Pull fire, and the rifle's useless once it's soaked. And the knife's harder to use because cold hands lose the fine touch that field work asks for. Each one fills a hole the other two leave open. Take any of them away and you feel the hole right off. The logic doesn't get any simpler than this, because the country doesn't allow for simpler. 3 things. Not a truck full. Not a catalogue. In a mountain man's accounting, these were the last things he'd sell, and the first things he'd replace. Not because they cost the most in the pack, but because they were the only things he couldn't make out of what the country gave him. You could boil water in a bark container if you had to. You could sleep under a fallen tree. You could eat roots if it came to that. But you couldn't sharpen a stick fine enough to do what a knife does. You couldn't make fire with your bare hands in wet weather in the time it would matter. And you couldn't take a bull elk at 100 yards with an attitude and a prayer. There's no money in teaching a man 3 things he masters once and carries for life. There's plenty of money in selling him doubt. The doubt that what he's got isn't quite right, that the new model's better, that he needs one more layer in the pack. The old hands knew better, and Pete Dumont said it plain. The more you know, the less you carry. So this weekend, pick up a fixed-blade knife you trust, and make sure you actually know its edge. Sharpen it, use it, and learn what it can and can't do before you ever need the answer. Next month, buy a flint and steel kit and learn to make char cloth. Don't just own the thing. Make fire with it in bad weather, till your hands know the motion without your eyes being any part of it. That's the day the tool becomes yours. The rifle takes the most time of all to master. Start with the principle before the practice. Know your firearm the way the old hands knew theirs, because knowing it means something when the shot can't wait. Now tell me down in the comments, which one of these 3 do you think most folks get wrong today? And if you've had a moment out in the country where one of these things decided it for you, I want to hear it. Every one of those stories teaches the rest of us something worth knowing. The next video is about what happens when men lose these 3 things. The rescues that worked, the ones that didn't, and what the difference was. We'll look at Hugh Glass, and at a trapper's winter alone with no fire kit, and we'll look at what the survivors had in common that the men who didn't make it never seemed to. Until then, carry little. Master it. That's still how it's done in any country that remembers.